The topic is Agile Contracts. We have Mike Harris, who's going to give us a 20-minute intro of Agile Contracts, and then we have our esteemed panel of Chris Urban, David Bulkin, and Paul Eisenberg, who you missed their intros on.
So, the main, hello everybody, sorry. The main point of interest today is the panel discussion, not really these slides. So I'm going to rattle through them pretty quick. Anybody wants them, come and see me afterwards. So what I just wanted to do was talk a little bit about what we do. So at Premios, what we do is we sell stuff at two levels. So we sell stuff as consultants to top-end companies, Citi, Lloyds Bank, American Express, people like that, and we sell them advice. We're consultants to them, and we're trying to help them improve their software development through better metrics and better processes. Okay, so that for years that was what my company was all about. Now there's another part of it, which is the software development part, and now we actually have to do what we say we do, and that's relevant to this session because now we're on both sides of it. So we've gone from advising our clients how to screw their vendors by, putting in place suitable contracts around Agile, to being on the other end of that and being the vendors that are getting screwed by our clients trying to put Agile contracts in place. So we've got some sort of relevance around that. So we do a whole bunch of stuff around integration, dev, web apps, all that sort of thing. And what we've learned is that none of our clients actually have strong opinions on how we integrate their applications. They want them integrated. They want it all integrated, they don't really care how we do it. All of our clients have strong opinions on how we should implement their CMS systems. So that's the relevance to this, in the sense that when you're actually putting together contracts around this, in a lot of times they see the software development part of it as a black box. When you're doing anything that's heavily user-oriented, anything to do with user experience, anything with CMS systems, they care a lot about not just the form of the contract, but the content. But they don't quite say it like that. The way they say it is, when you've done it and you ask for the money, they say that's not what we wanted. Okay, that's the way it always comes out. So we have to be really careful around this stuff.
So I mentioned before, and we got quite good at this over the years, fixing the requirements.
Oh, sorry, this is playing audio now for some reason. What I'm going to do, I'm going to step out of that. I'm just going to show you the slides like this, just to save solving that. Is that okay with everybody?
Yep.
Okay. So a bit of compare and contrast about how we get into this place for Agile contracting. So we have to contrast it with what every contracting officer and procurement officer is used to doing today. Okay? So in the good old days, which still exists in a lot of organisations, what you would do is you'd fix the requirements for the project. You'd get some sort of functional size estimate from the vendor. Might include sort of functional size, might just be a number. You'd validate the functional size estimate. And then you'd place the contract. Okay? Then the vendor would start work, and you'd have to manage all the changes along the way. You'd have arguments about what each change cost, what the functional size was. The vendor finishes, and then you validate the final functional size and get paid, basically. Easy to contract for. Designed for contracting. Not designed for the real world, because obviously in Agile it doesn't work like that. In Agile...
Is that making anybody feel ill? It makes me feel a little ill.
But that's the way it works. The way it still does. I mean, and again, we've all gone through this wonderful Agile thing where we all think this is the right way to do things. Bear in mind that you can still walk into organisations large and small and say to the procurement officer Agile, and they've not the faintest idea what you're talking about. Yeah? Let's get the requirements straight. I want to know exactly what's going to be delivered. I want to know exactly when it's going to be delivered. That's what we're going to sign up for.
That's what they called the good old days.
Yeah, indeed. So I just want to contrast what this looks like, and this one does need to be bigger. Let me go back to this again. All right, so this is how waterfall works in terms of sort of a timeline. I've split the chart here just so you know. So this is percent of business best possible solution. So we're somewhere above 70% usually most of the time. So here's what happens is as the development team understanding over time grows, and at some point there's a sign-off on requirements in the waterfall world. Okay, This represents the customer's understanding of the best possible solution. Okay? So there's usually some difference when you actually sign off on the requirements, but you do change requests, so you sort of creep up towards this. The development team's understanding develops, and so you get up to a point where, based on what you contracted for and you did the contract change control, you end up somewhere here. And that's what the customer actually needs. Okay? But, look at the lovely lines on this. I'm a contracting officer or a procurement officer or whatever, I understand how this works. It's nice and linear. These aren't linear, but it's okay, because I've got a good contract. Okay, so this is more like the way Agile works and why Agile works. So we've got the why and how it works. So we start off initially and we're doing discovery. So although there's a big gap here, because they've only specified high-level requirements at this point, we're actually sort of, the development team's understanding is just tracking quite close. And the customers having input at sprint reviews and planning meetings and things like that. So these two things are tracking quite close. And they actually get up quite close to each other. Okay, but there's customer input happening all the way through this. So there's nothing here really to contract for. So how do you contract? That's the real challenge, is we don't know what we're going to get at the end when we start out the journey. And we don't know when we're going to get it. Yeah, if you remember, actually I'll put the two, I think I've got the two together. Yeah, so about here is where we delivered what we contracted for. There was the big gap. But even here, we're still carrying on. We're still doing more work because their needs are continuously changing. Okay, so this is really hard to contract for if we look at that flow.
So the problem with Agile contracts...
Oh, this is another noisy one. So, the problem with Agile contracts is they're almost always time and materials for this very reason. Because you can't predict in advance, because you can't specify in advance, you're paying time and materials. As a procurement person, as an investor, what I get out of it is that the customer satisfaction is going to be high. What I hate out of it is that I don't know what I'm going to get and when I'm going to get it. Okay? And that's really important to me because I have other dependencies on me. So I'm accountable to the company for the money. If I'm the investor, I've probably got lots of dependencies in terms of what I'm going to deliver when. There's probably other groups that need what I'm doing. You know, the bigger the company gets, the more interdependencies there are on what I'm doing. So predictability, some sort of roadmap is really important to me. Yeah, and most developers sitting in most teams love Agile because they don't have to care about any of this. Yeah, and they can neatly say, oh, well, that's not Agile. The number of times I've heard, oh, well, that's not Agile, when we talk about any planning or any sort of sense of what we're going to deliver when, is ridiculous. So, problem with T&M contracts, from a procurement perspective, is they measure inputs, not outputs. Okay, so they measure effort. Okay, now you could argue that the old waterfall contracts measured requirements, and that's an input as well, but it is a definition of the output. And what we really should be doing is contracting against outputs and outcomes. Okay, now I want to tee up for how we do that. So that's really the point for us to discuss today, how we measure outputs and outcomes from Agile projects, because if we can't measure them, we can't contract against them. Okay, we have an approach in my company that we call fixed price Agile. I talked about this at an Agile Philly meeting not so long ago. And essentially what we do is, what we're trying to do is take out some of the variability out of Agile projects. So we know that we don't want to measure individual teams, and Scrum teams, and we know that we don't want to measure individual sprints. There are tools for planning that. You use Planning Poker, you use story points, you use Kanban, whatever you want to use. That's Kanban. I'll pronounce it properly for everyone in the audience. No, Kanban. I'm going to talk English today. It's been taking the mick out of me all afternoon for being British.
You're not going to talk about process, right?
Absolutely.
Oh boy.
So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the key point is that you create an aggregate of X teams and Y sprints, and you measure the output. Okay, and you measure the output in a way that's. I heard somebody talking about this on Monday. I was at an Agile meeting in Denver, and they said, well, we measure things relatively with story points because there are no absolute metrics for measuring output. And that sort of, all right, sounds okay. But actually there are absolute metrics for measuring software outputs. They're called function points. Okay, who here has heard of function points? Okay. As far as Agile, if I put my Agile hat on, they're terrible. They're what our grandparents did. We should never use function points. Again, they're totally un-Agile. They measure things. Well, frankly, that's just ridiculous. But that's what we hear a lot. So we can use function points actually to take away the fact that all story points for all teams are different. You can't aggregate story points. They're brilliant. They fulfill a purpose. We love them. We coach them. We train them. But they're team specific, and they should be team specific. They're a team tool. They're not a corporate tool for aggregating things up. So there's a way of doing that with function points. I'm not going to go into that into too much more detail because, again, to tee up the panel discussion, that is measuring output. That's measuring, even if you use function points, you're measuring functional output. You're not measuring outcomes. Okay? So what's an outcome? Just sitting on David's session, an outcome is more total revenue for the theme park in a particular period. Yeah? It's not 50 function points as opposed to 40 function points. Yeah? So how do we get to that point, and how do we wrap that into contracts? So I think that's this is just an example of how the output pricing works. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail because what's important is that we have a conversation about how we contract for and measure outcomes and outputs from Agile contracts. So that's my quick introduction. Are there any questions on that before I shut up and we open it up to the panel? Okay, so let me pass it over. Who wants to start? Chris. Yeah,
Okay.
A shot. We'll go down. Actually, no. I'm actually going to start with David because David might have to slip away early.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did grow up because my daughter's going to a prom and never met the boy, so...
It's got a clean shot there.
Yeah. Got to get out of here. So David, let me throw that one over to you.
Well, let me go get some of the things you said. Traditionally, you're trying to fix everything. The people in Agile say you can't measure the total aggregate size. Function points try to measure total aggregate size. But even there, you don't really want to measure that. You want to measure some outcomes in your business. So, to me, the ultimate is a partnership where if the results are good, then you get paid more, right? Mm-hmm. Clearly, though, many companies aren't ready to work that way. So what I would say is the placeholder that's worked for me is actually going back to T&M, but having the company that's paying the T&M being acutely aware of whether or not they're deriving sufficient economic benefit to continue the relationship. Meaning the vendor is not necessarily incentivized by good outcomes other than by virtue of the fact that the contract has continued. Mm-hmm. I don't consider that the ultimate contract. I mean, I think the ultimate contract would actually say if vendor does really well, they get paid even more, mm-hmm. right? That would be the ultimate. That's not what I'm saying, because I think it's just hard to make those types of contracts. But there's definitely pockets of what I'm seeing of where, we get people from the company involved enough that they understand the economic benefit being derived and hence can decide if the contract should continue.
And would you say that continuance, does the payer, the client as it were, get to decide that on a sprint by sprint basis or a longer term time frame?
Well, obviously if you're the vendor, you want to have some warning, right? And you have some renewal periods, right, depending what you do, because you don't want your folk on the bench. Sure. Right, so I think generally what I'm seeing is people have some notice that you have to give in order to stop the relationship. Right, those are pure things. I don't know if you had the money for nothing, whatever, change for free thing in there. I think you had a version of that in your slide.
Yeah, I just did a short one,
yeah. Which I think some people in the community know, like you kind of set like some goals, and if the vendor finishes it really early, then the person paying can stop it early, and they don't have to pay all the money, but they're kind of giving some kind of bonus money because it's done early, and that means it's good for everyone, right? Because the vendor has people on the bench, but they have extra money that they can pay those people with when they're on the bench and just find new work for them, and the person, the payee, is in a good position because they paid less total money.
Right.
Right. Those are the type of things. I mean, I think that'd be beautiful. People went for those types of contracts. I think eventually we'll get there. But what I'm seeing more is intelligent T&M.
Right.
Time and materials.
Yeah.
Right. Which is a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Step in the right direction.
So I'll go back to Chris. Chris.
Okay, so a couple of things. For our projects, we use a variety of mechanisms. T&M is preferred, as you said, just because it's win-win, best of the worst case for us and for us as a vendor and for the customer. One thing that we do that is helps to define what the outputs are is early consensus with the customer as much as it can be derived accurately. So there's almost iterative contracting, which is kind of ironic. There is a preliminary assessment of what the work is going to be, and so there's an investment in generating that assessment, and that is the initial agreement. But the caveat is that is going to change. It's not that there might be a change request. There usually is a change request. There has to be a change request. There's some rock that's going to be discovered in the first week of development, and that will break everything. Let's say that's the worst case. The goal is to get the customer on that path of iterating in terms of understanding what their deliverable is, and that it is not a fixed fee project. That's the other solution, right? We're going to deliver, you're going to get this site with this functionality for this dollar amount, presumably in some time, some reasonable amount of time. But the fixed fee is the constraint. With T&M, I mean, theoretically, you can go on forever as you keep changing and changing and changing, but the customer doesn't want that, and I don't necessarily want that, or do I? But the idea is you want the customer to be successful. That's the number one parameter. With that iterative contracting mechanism, an early discovery, a reevaluation of that discovery, and agreement of what is targeted to be delivered, the assessment of that list of features, and they're not even epics, let's call them features, and assessing that and continually refining that to us is the most important step in the process to establish with a customer. It's also important to reevaluate this on a regular basis, like at the end of every sprint. Something gets done early, that means we're done early. You know, it's T&M, you're committed for a certain amount. You commit for $500,000. You've got these resources. I don't want to let them go to another project. What else do you want us to work on? So now the list of items in your, I'm really oversimplifying this, but the list of items in your backlog, the things that were not in your phase one or your MVP, I hate to use that, there's the highest of what was not in that, or conversely, you're doing more development, it's more complicated than you expected, we need to horse trade, something has to come out, otherwise you're not going to meet that initial projection. That conversation with the customer, it's not a one-time, it's ongoing, it's every sprint, or on a weekly status meeting. I mean, that's crazy, but let's say every sprint, you make that assessment. Are we on track? We can get into like Jira versioning and things like that to keep an eye on this, but the idea is that output is not so much points as it is at that feature level. The customer defines done for the feature, not for the project, and the agreement on where that can stop or how much of that needs to be done becomes more and more granular as the project progresses. You ultimately get to that point of customer success. That's the name of the game, right? If the customer is happy, they'll come back, they'll do more work. That's the hope. But you also want them to learn to course correct, not to go all in and say, okay, by December 31 we want X. You know, comes October, the CTO is out and all the directions change. What happens to the contract? You can't be, we will not go into something like that locked in without that flexibility defined.
I was going to ask that. I mean, you talked about some fixed price contracts. Are you...
Well, and so there is that option, because there are customers that will want to function in that manner to say, here's the list of those requirements. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to prom.
Yeah, good luck. Good luck.
See you in the future, Agile Collision.
There are the customers that are looking for very specific deliverables, and those are the cases where you know, we need to migrate our entire website. That's an easy one. Like the definition there is that everything that's functional right now is existing on the new site. That's easy. I can quantify that. I can define when it's done because I know where it is now. It's the when I need to create something new, undefined, that's where you run into trouble. The other option is fixed capacity, right? So that's a promise to deliver. I'm basically providing staff augmentation. I've got the customer has an internal development team. They need help. They need enablement. They need extra support, guidance. I'm committing to providing resources for X amount of time. We figure out what that time is, and now we can estimate what the capacity is, which is great for resource planning, but that also means I could have devs sitting around twiddling their thumbs. Yeah. So, nothing's perfect.
few different models there. Are you taking any contracts or writing any contracts that are based on outputs or outcomes?
No, well, yes. I'm so glad you asked. So I'll give a little background to why I'm part of this conversation. So our background is I run a professional services organization for a small, about 100 employees, maybe $20 million software company. I don't know if that's small, but in the old days we used to do projects and we had a hard time ending projects. We had a hard time getting paid for projects. We had a hard time satisfying customers. And we adopted Agile. So back in those old days, it was sort of the picture that Mark showed with the first one, the waterfall, that made me feel a little ill. Yeah. It made me feel ill because I was remembering all
Not a little ill, ill.
Just ill. Remember those bad old days. So then we adopted Agile, and we tried to come up with a contract mechanism that was consistent with Agile, more consistent with that second slide, which to me feels more like reality, right? Because, and so what we did is, we came up with it's sort of a mix of these different things that you've heard David and Chris talking about. We don't really do the heavy metric-based outcome measurement because we're really typically only talking about a single team. And I think your approach is really for even bigger situations when you have many teams. And it's a fascinating approach, and that's why I've been talking to Mark a lot, trying to understand that and integrate it. Anyhow, so our approach is we basically came up, our idea is that a fixed price contract is a lose-lose. A lot of times you hear clients say, well, if it's time and materials, then we're assuming all the risk. And if it's fixed price, it's your risk. And I'm like, well, not really. If it's fixed, it's your risk too, because if we fail, you fail. Because that's not good. We need a win-win contract, and a win-win contract is when we can answer the question, what am I going to get, how is it going to take, what is it going to cost? And of course that's kind of hard to answer, but the best answer we've been able to come up with is the following. It's sort of a little bit of this improved time material, staff augmentation, I don't know what you want to call it, but basically we say we're going to give you a scrum team of 3.5 full-time equivalent or 4.5 full-time equivalent for 12 weeks, maybe 6 sprints, or 10 weeks, 5 sprints, or 20 weeks, which is 10 2-week sprints, and we're going to give you this FTE level over this period of time. So it's a fixed cost, right? And what's really variable is the scope, but really the scope is always variable, right? Even when you say it's fixed, we all know it's not really fixed. So we're just recognizing up front that it's variable. And the way we describe it is that if we see a spreadsheet of 500 line items of requirements, we kind of run the other direction. So this does not work where there's a blind RFP. It does not work if it's public sector and you've got one of those this is not that situation. This is a situation where you're actually having a conversation with the customer and you say, listen, I'm going to describe your objectives at a high level. And maybe the 10 bullets, we're going to describe the functional objectives. And we're going to leave all the rest of those other details, those 500 line items, the team is going to work that out. And at the end of this period, whether it's 10 weeks or 20 weeks, you're going to have a system that basically does all these things, but we're not going to talk about how and at what level. And oh, by the way, if you decide that, we're working in your direction, if you decide that you want to knock 2 of these bullets off and put 2 more in, that's fine too. because we're working at your direction. We don't do any of this. Let's not waste any time with formal change management. We just assume change is going to happen. And this is great because projects end on time. It's over when the sprints are over, and we get paid because it's there's milestone payments that are not. And if we put in a couple extra hours here and there to make it work, then that's on us. But we want the customer to be happy. And I'll just thank you for the time to give that introduction of how we operate. But I just want to say one thing. So our company recently went through a merger, and we merged with a company that does a lot of government contracting. And they really didn't understand this contract model because they do these big fix things. But now, like many of our clients, once they've seen the way this works and they've seen that the projects are successful, they end on time, we get paid, and the customers are happy, they actually now like this form of contract. So it's tricky. We're not always successful getting it through the first time in procurement, but if we get one through, we typically have no problem getting the next one through.
You're hearing a lot here about communication. Communication, and of course that's one of the key things on the Agile Manifesto. Communicate rather than contracting or head of contracting. I mean, one of the things that I've experienced, with the software company last year was that we were working with a customer that was not disciplined about this, and they had a budget to spend, plenty of money, and they got in a situation where they made so many changes. So we got about a third of the way through the project. We'd thrown up a user interface that, they wanted to be absolutely perfect. Head and shoulders above all their competitors and everything else.
Red flag.
Yeah, red flag. So what happens? They end up spending half of the budget on that when they should have been spending about 25% of the budget. Then when we got to the end of the program and the budget ran out, it was our fault. Clearly our fault. Yeah, so I think there's, you have to be careful. These flexible contracting and talking to the customer, there's a responsibility on the customer.
So one thing you mentioned...
Customers have amnesia, I'm sorry. Right?
Oh, yeah, right. That's my point. I mean, you need to remind them constantly. And the more often you do it, they'll finally oblige 6 months later. Oh, yeah, you've been talking about that. Yeah, you've been listening. You mentioned something interesting, though, that you don't outline, or you don't, you acknowledge, and the customer acknowledges that there is going to be change. But I find it much more helpful to outline, even if it's just a feature level assessment, and it's not even a discovery. It's like a solutions architect call. I know you need from a static starter list, you need 5 things from my list of 10 things that all sites are going to need, and we know we're going to do these 5 things. Knowing that I list those 5, I get the conversation started, because the last thing any customer wants is a surprise, well, why wasn't this included? You have this in a contract, and yes, we are T&M, but these are the 5 things that we're going to focus on, because now if you say, oh, by the way, we just remembered number 6, well, that wasn't included in the estimate. 5 comes out for 6? How does that, what do you want to do? The change request conversation. Yeah, there's always, right, there's the CYA factor, but there's also the prioritization factor, because that's the other problem we always run into. Like, there's always 5 number 1s, not 1 through 5. Now you throw in 6, now there's 6 number 1s, which one is it? Getting them to acknowledge that, to prioritize, to focus on that, and constantly reevaluate on a regular basis, and not go into it as a, here's the contract, bye, I'll talk to you in 6 months. They have to stay engaged. Communication, absolutely. That's the paramount.
So I've got lots of questions for these guys, because it's always very interesting talking. I want to throw it out, because this is really about you guys. Yeah, please.
So when I worked in consulting, which is a while back, and it was when Agile was barely emerging, whatever firm I was working for, we were doing some project for basically speculative outcome. That is, we would take a cut of the positive impact. And I mean, I feel Agile is actually better suited to do this. I mean, it's really more of a measurement issue of measuring it before and after. And So what about either doing that or finding a kind of a middle way model where there would be, time and material, and then an incentive on the value created?
It's great. It's fascinating. I think it's. I mean, it's if there's a very clear-cut way to measure the value created, that's fabulous, right? But that's not always that clear. And now some systems, I mean, I guess that's the problem, right? So I think in cases where that is possible, I would love that model. I just don't think it's always possible. But maybe, I don't think there's any answer that's magical for every situation. Even the one I described, we don't do every contract that way. I mean, we do a variety of contract types depending on the situation, but I like that idea for certain situations.
Yeah, I'm going to say that this is where the line between the contracting and the delivery blurs. How much do you include formally within the contract? You're defining the resources, you're defining some vague features, and you're giving the outline of the process. But then, from your perspective, how do you define what the value of this engagement is? That comes out of the first part of the engagement at the kickoff. What are the KPIs? What is the business goals? What's the executive summary that if the CEO walks in right now and says, well, what the hell are you guys working on? We can say, well, we're going to build a new website to increase revenue, gain more customers, one of those. And we're going to do it this way. Okay, so now everybody has some metric to measure against. Hopefully the customer's got some sense of where they are now, and you can check when the project is done or evaluate 6 months after the project is done to say, yeah, this was successful, this was meh, or this was not successful.
Can I just jump in? I'm sorry, one more point on that. Just while you were talking, this occurred to me. What I like about that idea, and I think, like with Agile, sometimes it's not about the particular process details, it's about the values. And then if you are tuned into the values, then you sort of end up doing the right thing. And I think what I like about your suggestion is that it aligns the customer's interests with the vendor's interests.
Yep.
And when you're aligned, you're partners, and you're marching towards the same goal. And that's the problem with those fixed price contracts, right? Because now it's contentious, you're adversarial. And that's a lose-lose. But whereas what you're suggesting is a win-win, and that's what we need.
Yep.
Can I add a point to that? Because I like that idea also. The challenge with it, though, is that inherent in that are the assumptions that your customer has introduced, that they think that this will actually improve the outcome. And it could be that their assumption is completely wrong. And that you do this chunk of work, and it gets worse.
You're in trouble, right? You're jumping in that sinking ship with them.
Exactly.
That's a whole other panel.
But I think where I've seen this come up, and I want to sort of compare and contrast two worlds. So the thing that I was talking about is very much our big clients and how they look at this, and I want to come back to that. But where we're working as a small team, as largely these guys are slightly different numbers, but really small teams. What happens is you end up generating part of the intellectual property because the requirements aren't defined. In the waterfall world, define everything. You're really just more or less following a recipe. In the Agile world, high-level requirements, there's a lot of creativity that comes from the teams, from the vendor. And the way I've seen that play out is some IP sharing after the fact. So, we created this set of capabilities, that we did to support yours, but we're going to take those away. We're going to use them again for other customers. So it's not quite revenue sharing, but there is a benefit that accrues to the development team for the next project and the next project and the next project, whether it's templates or whatever. I think if I look at big, how many people here are from large corporations?
Define large.
More than 100,000.
Comcast, Express, okay, so, I mean, with the struggle they're facing with as they transform to Agile is a lot of the things we've been talking about absolutely map onto what they did when they started introducing Scrum and things. There were 2 or 3 Scrum teams in the organisation, fantastic results, word got around, everybody wanted to do that. The bank we're working with in the UK, where a lot of this model work was done, 2,000 people. That's a lot of Scrum teams. Outsourced to 6 different vendors. 2 vendors have got most of it. And there's a huge tension between the agile people in the bank who are running these teams, managing the software development and everything, and the PMO and the vendor management organisation who are held accountable for ratcheting costs down by a certain percentage every year. That's how they get paid.
Yep.
So in that world, it is about screwing the vendor. And frankly, a lot of the vendors deserve it.
Preach!
I'll give you an example of one of our other clients. We went into this other client, actually it had to be in the UK as well, although we were mainly US, but and they when we came in there, they said, we've got really good outsourcing of our software development. We've got our rate card, you know, the daily rates, that's gone down by 20%, 23% and 21% in the last 3 years. And my head's exploding. What on earth are you getting? When we actually looked at the cost had gone up roughly 8% a year. So what was happening was every year that they accepted this rate card, they just put more people on the project. And in one classic example, we looked at one particular project where there were 41 people on it. And after we revised, this is in a foreign country, I won't name it. And when we looked at it and revised it and took it back in-house, there were 9 people producing the same output.
Wow.
So when I say that some of the vendors deserve it, this is again, because the scale is so big, this is where some of these other controls come in, because nobody, not one person actually understands everything that's going on across all those 2,000 people. And so conversations like we're talking about here, people aren't empowered low enough down the organisation where those conversations are taking place. They're not empowered to make the sort of decisions that we're talking about here. So I think it is, and of course somewhere in the middle, those two things cross over.
Yeah.
So what Chris and Paul have been able to achieve, and we've been able to achieve similar things with our clients in our little world, really don't apply in those big organisations.
Well, okay. I think you can try to, but there's something to be said for any organization that enormous, the complexity inherent with it. I don't know that there's going to be any right way of doing it that is not going to unmask the, how do I call it, inefficiencies.
Yeah,
but I think if there's clear communication and direction from some, not I want to say all the way up, but some reasonably high up level, I think a lot of that can be overcome. Maybe I'm too not as cynical as I ought to be. As long as the success of the customer is maintained as a paramount priority, I think that will be achieved. When that line starts getting blurred, as it sometimes does, that's when those rules go out the window, as you described.
Well, and so the key thing you said there is, how do you measure the success of the customer?
Right. Well, is the customer happy? Right. And if they're not, if they're blind to what's going on, I think then that's on us to not hide.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I agree with you, Mark, that there could be a difference where I sell projects where we're one team, and it could be a small company that we're selling into, or Fortune 6 company.
Yeah, right.
But it's one team, right?
Yeah.
Versus the situation that Mark's talking about, where you have a team of many teams that you're trying to manage. That's a fundamentally different situation. But people ask me about metrics all the time. So in that other situation, where you're trying to measure teams across teams, you do need some kind of metric that's not team dependent, and that's why I think this function point thing is kind of very interesting.
Yeah.
But when you're just one team, I'm like, I don't need metrics because I know when it's good and I know when it's bad. It's kind of pretty obvious.
You know when it's
right?
stalling.
Let's not overcomplicate this. If you're happy. Everybody knows when the project's going well. And everybody knows when the project is sucking.
Going on rails.
So it's like, let's not complicate this, right? But that doesn't work when you have teams of teams and big,
But I argue that can still happen. I've seen projects with, 8 teams. That's probably the limit. After that, we're not doing Drupal or Agile at that, or the software development we normally do. This is getting to be a much bigger project. But at that scale, there's still the same principles remain: clear communication, regular cadence, check-ins. Everybody knows
sucking or when it's not.
Yeah, and you know right away. I mean, you'll know in an hour. As soon as that one thing goes off the rail and everything starts backing up, right? And it's usually like one key resource.
That guy.
But you know right away. I don't know that. I don't know. I haven't seen beyond that level, but I don't think I discriminate between, let's say, 8 to 10 teams in a single team. I still see that at the same level. I think when you get maybe to 50, 100 teams, yes, now we're getting into a completely different animal.
First question at the back there.
Yeah, I'm not in the whole Scrum world, so this is like
eye-opening.
Great, yeah. I was very interested in your input to outputs measure points. I understand what you mean by features. What's the function point?
Right, so function points are sort of ancient history. So, do you know what story points are?
Yeah.
Yeah, so story points are relative. You look at your stories, you choose which one's the easiest, you assign that one, and all the others are relative to that. Yeah, so it might be a 3 or a 5 or an 8, whatever it might be. Okay. With function points, it was invented by IBM back in the 70s, and it's actually a way of looking at the architecture of the requirement from the user perspective and allocating weights to inputs and outputs and external files and internal files. So you count all those up, you allocate weights according to a big set of rules, and you can get a function point count, which tells you the size of the problem, and it's comparable across many types of projects. So you could get 100 function points. It's the same size problem in COBOL as it is in Java, as it is in assembly language.
So the function point is a rating, not like a particular set of work.
No, it's a rating. It's a size. If you think about it, it's a size.
But the point is, I think the main point is, I think Kokomo is a thing there, right?
So Kokomo uses that. Kokomo is an estimation formula.
Okay.
So it's like an equation for doing estimation.
Okay, but I think the main takeaway is, though, you can look at the work product and use this as a way of analyzing the size and complexity of it, the output, the value, right? More is better, independent of the technology, independent of the teams, independent of the circumstance under which they develop the work. And again, it's inputs, outputs, internal, externals, and so. But it's funny. So the first time I met Mark and I heard him speak and I heard about this, and I went back and we were having an outing with our team, and these are all senior engineers and they're maybe a little younger than I am, and I was like, so guys, who here knows what a function point is? And I remembered it from, I went to Penn State, got my master's, and I remember it from that, but we never heard of it since. And none of these engineers could answer the question. So it is from, it is ancient history, but it doesn't mean it's not valuable. That's just interesting.
So when we say it's ancient history, it's used most these days in outsourcing contracts, big outsourcing contracts, because essentially the vendor agrees to pay, or the client agrees to pay a certain price per function point. So they're measuring the amount of delivery. So for instance, AT&T outsourced to IBM. One of our clients. Okay, so every month IBM delivers a release back to AT&T. AT&T pay them so many dollars per function point delivered. So it doesn't matter whether AT&T are working on Java or COBOL or whatever it is, they get so many dollars for every function point they deliver. And that's how the contract's written up. Okay, because on that huge scale, IBM deliver anything between 50 and 250 projects a month. So on that sort of scale, you need some way of repeatedly and simply paying them and identifying what they delivered.
But it's value, end result value oriented.
So I'm going to create an analogy to completely butcher it, and hopefully it falls apart. And I'm like, oh yeah. All right. So I used to teach, and in a year, I would give like 8 tests or whatever, and so there's generally there's 10 tests, 1,000 points that anybody could actually get.
Yeah.
So is it kind of rating like, you're good at this part of this thing, not that part. But if you add that up, it'll be at some level. Is that kind of?
Not a rating in that sense. A better way of saying it is to treat it, if I'm buying bricks from my vendor, yeah, I'm going to pay them so much per brick.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they may deliver at different rates at different times, they may deliver different styles of brick, and I've taken that all into account. At the end of the day, I'm
you
going to
pay more for red bricks and less for blue bricks.
So I pay a blended rate for each brick.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to get, at the end of the month, I've seen that this month they delivered 100 bricks. Because they're all different complexity, different colours, different shapes, different size, I don't want to deal with that, I just want to pay a certain rate per brick.
Okay.
So that's a better analogy maybe.
And so then, it just sounds like you only get paid at the end of the contract. You don't get like a monthly flow rate. I don't.
So that's true. You get paid when you complete things. So the delivery cycle, you know, in the agile world, you might get stage payment. Sorry, in the waterfall world, you get paid stage payments, but basically you didn't get paid till you delivered and the requirements are signed off. In the agile world, because you've got continuous delivery, you should be getting paid for the functionality as you go along.
Okay.
Hence the T&M. Yeah.
Well, hence the T&M, not really, you should get paid on the value what delivered.
I agree, right.
So,
but the assumption is there is, there's that.
But what tends to happen is you're paying for the input. So I'm paying for the 6.5 people that Paul's provided me. I'm paying them whether they deliver, 50 story points for that sprint or 5 story points for that sprint. I'm still paying the same. So if I'm one of these, vendor management, project management people at the big client, I'm going, hang on a minute. That's not right. I need to be paying based on what you delivered, not what it's like in the brick analogy, it's like you're paying because they bought a whole bunch of straw and clay and all that sort of stuff, or because I bought all that, the fact that they screwed it up and they delivered 2 bricks from that this month instead of 200.
Broke down, so they had to put it on the gurney.
Yeah, and a couple fell off the back of the truck and stuff like that. But yeah, sorry.
Reality.
Yeah, question.
My question about one of the bricks, right?
Mm.
So can I just say that, hey, here's 100, but then you say, whoa, it's only 50. So how do you kind of reconcile that?
Well, that's one of the advantages. I mean, one of the snags of story points is that they're specific to the team.
Mm-hmm.
You can't aggregate them up, and it works because story points and planning poker are all about getting the team to get to a better estimate. It's a process, not a metric. That's the important thing to take away from it. So if you can't use story points as a metric, you've got to have something that everybody can do the same way. And this is why function points. Function points, believe me, there are a lot of problems with function points. If there was a better way to do it, we'd totally use it. But it's sort of like democracy. It's the worst possible system in the world except for all the others. So the nice thing about function points is it's an international standard. Everybody follows a book of rules, so that as a vendor, I can count how many function points I had, when I delivered it. And as a client, I can count those function points again, and we do a little check-up, and we say, okay, we're close enough, okay, we're going to pay you.
So Mark, we're going to ask a question. So, talking about function points, and also makes me think back to K-locks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Without lines of code, right?
Yeah.
But the thing with lines of code is you could write 1,000 lines of code and get paid more for something you could have written with 100 lines of code, right? And that's the whole problem with that. But would it be possible for someone to game the system with function points?
So it's a lot harder because you're actually, there are these international standards, and you're delivering functionality that's been asked for. Can you game it? The sort of things, the way you game it is that I'll use IBM and AT&T. So one of the things that IBM used to do was they would put functionality in there and then comment it out. Yeah. Well, we built this functionality. The fact that you're not going to use it or not going to use it yet is not your problem. We need to get paid for the functionality. So, can it be gamed? It can, but it's much harder and it's pretty obvious. Yeah. Everything can be done. So, it's come back to this sort of outcomes. Trying to measure outcomes or outputs. I think my perspective is function points are not outcomes, but they're a step towards it, which is outputs, which is better than measuring inputs.
Yep.
That being said, it's all about risk, and I think the guys both said this. The risk in time and materials is pretty much all on one side. Even though, as Paul says, if the developers fail, then the whole project's failed. That's true, but the developer walks away with the cash they've been paid for time and materials.
Right.
So, you know, some sort of shift to some sort of fixed pricing, some sort of way of measuring outputs has got to happen. I think outputs are easier than outcomes because outcomes are always going to be different for every single project.
We're probably running out of time, but I just want to echo a piece of that and reinforce something I said earlier, which I think is really the heart of the matter, which is if you ever are in a conversation with a client or a vendor, and somebody talks about risk, right? And the idea is if you're trying to put the risk all on one side or the other, you're probably going to lose. And if you're looking at about aligning interests, that's a game that everybody can win. And I think that's what it really boils down to.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway.
Yep. No, I'm with you. I mean, you know that there's the spectrum of customer experiences. If the customer is interested in being a partner, the project is more likely to be successful. If the customer is, steadfast, waterfall, they're not. It's more about the meat grinder. It's the machine. This is the process. I really don't care who the vendor is. Then it's irrelevant. It's not going to matter. That relationship, that's establishing and maintaining that relationship is important.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let's have a